Sarah Martinez crumpled the maintenance request in her fist as she stared at the broken playground slide that had injured 3 children that week. "Just fix it somehow," the facility manager had said dismissively before walking away. 20 minutes later, she handed her hand-drawn sketch to the head engineer, and his face went completely white. The room fell silent as he stared at structural calculations that would have taken his team weeks to develop, all drawn perfectly by the woman they'd been treating like she was invisible. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of people proving everyone wrong through hidden talents, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Sarah had been invisible for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Every morning at 5:30, she'd kiss her sleeping daughter Emma goodbye and drive her beaten Honda Civic to Riverside Elementary, where she'd spend the next 10 hours mopping floors, emptying trash cans, and cleaning up after people who looked right through her as if she were part of the furniture. The other staff members knew her name, but barely. To them, she was just the janitor, a quiet woman in her 30s who kept her head down and did her job without complaint. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a degree in structural engineering. What they couldn't see beneath her worn work uniform was a brilliant mind that had once designed bridges and skyscrapers, a mind that had calculated load-bearing capacities and stress distributions for some of the most prestigious firms in Boston. That was before her husband David died in a construction accident, before the medical bills from his final months in the hospital bankrupted them, before she had to choose between keeping her engineering license current and putting food on the table for her 6-year-old daughter. The playground at Riverside Elementary had been a source of concern for months. The main slide, a towering structure that was the centerpiece of the children's outdoor area, had developed what the school board euphemistically called structural issues. 3 children had been injured in the past 2 weeks alone, nothing serious, just bumps and bruises, but enough to make parents nervous and administrators anxious. The slide's support beams were shifting, causing the entire structure to wobble dangerously whenever children climbed on it. The school had brought in contractors, inspectors, and even a consulting engineering firm, but the estimates they received were staggering. Replacing the entire playground structure would cost over $200,000. Money the underfunded school simply didn't have. The cheaper option of trying to repair the existing structure came with its own set of problems. Every expert they consulted gave them a different opinion, and none of the proposed solutions seemed to address the root cause of the problem. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. Sarah was emptying the trash cans near the main office when she overheard Principal Johnson on the phone with the school board. His voice was strained with frustration as he explained that they'd have to close the playground indefinitely unless they could find a solution. The liability insurance wouldn't cover them if another child got hurt, and the parents were starting to demand answers. "We've tried everything," Principal Johnson was saying. "The engineers can't agree on what's causing the problem, and we can't afford any of their solutions anyway. At this point, I'm ready to just tear the whole thing down and leave the kids with an empty lot." Sarah finished emptying the trash and moved on to her next task, but Principal Johnson's words stayed with her throughout the morning. During her lunch break, instead of eating the peanut butter sandwich she'd packed, she found herself walking out to the playground to look at the problematic slide more closely. The structure was indeed unstable, but as Sarah examined the support beams and foundation, she could see immediately what the problem was. The original installation had been done incorrectly. The soil beneath the primary support posts hadn't been properly compacted, and over years of use and weather, it had shifted and settled unevenly. This had created a domino effect of stress on the connecting joints, causing the entire structure to become unstable. More importantly, Sarah could see exactly how to fix it. It wouldn't require replacing the entire playground or even major reconstruction. What it needed was a relatively simple but precise redistribution of the load-bearing elements, combined with proper foundation repair. It was the kind of problem she could have solved in her sleep back when she was practicing engineering. But she was just the janitor now. Who would listen to her? Sarah spent the rest of her lunch break walking around the slide, examining it from every angle, her engineering mind automatically calculating forces and stresses. By the time she had to return to work, She had a complete solution mapped out in her head. It was elegant, cost-effective, and would actually make the playground safer than it had ever been. That afternoon, she watched as facility manager Robert Chen arrived with yet another contractor in tow. This was the fourth different expert the school had brought in, and Sarah could tell from the contractor's body language that he was about to deliver the same disappointing news as all the others. She was cleaning the windows near the main entrance when she saw Principal Johnson's shoulders slump as the contractor shook his head and handed over another impossibly expensive estimate. After the contractor left, Sarah found herself face to face with a choice that would change everything. She could continue being invisible, continue keeping her head down and collecting her modest paycheck while the playground remained closed and the children lost their favorite place to play. Or she could risk everything: her job, her dignity, her carefully constructed new identity, by speaking up. The decision came to her in a moment of absolute clarity. Emma loved this playground. Every day after school, she would run straight to that slide, her face lighting up with pure joy as she climbed to the top and raced down. How many other children felt the same way? How many kids were now forced to stay inside during recess because the playground was closed? Sarah Martinez made her choice. She spent that evening at her kitchen table, working by the light of a single lamp while Emma did her homework nearby. Using nothing but a pencil and a few sheets of paper she'd taken from the school's supply closet, Sarah began to sketch. Her hands moved with the confident precision of someone who had spent years translating complex three-dimensional problems into two-dimensional solutions. First, she drew the existing structure, noting every beam, every joint, every potential point of failure. Then she began to overlay her solution, a series of modifications that would redistribute the weight more evenly, reinforce the critical stress points, and create a more stable foundation. She included detailed calculations showing the load distributions, stress tolerances, and safety margins. Every line on the paper represented hours of experience, years of training, and a level of expertise that most people would never suspect existed beneath her janitor's uniform. When she finished, Sarah had created a complete engineering solution that would cost less than $15,000 to implement, a fraction of what the other contractors had quoted, while actually improving the safety and durability of the structure beyond its original specifications. Emma looked up from her math homework and saw her mother surrounded by papers covered in diagrams and numbers. "What are you working on, Mom?" Sarah smiled at her daughter, remembering suddenly why she had fallen in love with engineering in the first place. "I'm trying to fix something that's broken, sweetheart. Something that will help a lot of kids be able to play safely again." "Like the slide at school? The one that's been closed?" "Exactly like that." Emma nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her. At 6 years old, she had no reason to doubt that her mother could fix anything. If only the adults at school had the same faith. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work with the sketches folded carefully in her pocket. She went through her usual routine, unlocking the building, turning on the lights, beginning her cleaning rounds, but her heart was pounding with nervous energy. She had decided to approach Robert Chen, the facility manager, during his usual morning coffee break. Sarah found him in the faculty lounge, scrolling through his phone while nursing a large cup of coffee. He looked up when she entered, his expression politely neutral in the way that people looked at service workers, acknowledging her presence without really seeing her. "Mr. Chen," Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wanted to talk to you about the playground situation." Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. It was probably the longest sentence he'd ever heard her speak. "What about it?" Sarah took a deep breath and pulled the folded papers from her pocket. "I think I might have a solution." The laugh that escaped Robert's mouth wasn't cruel, exactly, but it was dismissive. "Sarah, right? Look, I appreciate the concern, but we've had multiple engineering firms look at this. It's a complex structural problem that requires professional expertise." "I understand that," Sarah said quietly, unfolding her sketches and placing them on the table. "But I think you should look at this anyway." Robert glanced down at the papers, probably intending to give them a cursory look before politely dismissing her. But something about what he saw made him pause. The sketches weren't rough drawings or amateur suggestions. They were detailed technical diagrams with precise measurements, structural calculations, and professional-grade annotations. "Where did you get these?" Robert asked, his tone suddenly sharp with suspicion. "I drew them," Sarah said simply. Robert studied the papers more carefully, his expression growing increasingly confused. These are actual engineering drawings, with structural calculations." "Yes, they are. You drew these? You did these calculations?" Sarah nodded. "The problem isn't as complicated as the contractors are making it seem. The foundation settlement is causing uneven load distribution, but it can be corrected with targeted reinforcement and some strategic modifications to the support structure. Everything you need is detailed in those drawings." Robert was staring at her now as if seeing her for the first time. "Sarah, what exactly is your background?" "I have a degree in structural engineering from MIT. I worked for Thornton Tomasetti and several other firms before." She hesitated, then decided on the simple truth. "Before life got complicated and I needed a more flexible job." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Robert looked from Sarah to the sketches and back again, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the evidence in front of him. "You're telling me that you've been working here as a janitor for 2 years, and you're actually a structural engineer from MIT?" "Yes." Robert ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of pure bewilderment. "Why didn't you say anything before? Why didn't you tell us when we were dealing with this problem?" Sarah shrugged, a gesture that contained years of resignation and learned invisibility. "Would you have listened?" The question hung in the air between them, and Robert had the grace to look uncomfortable, because they both knew the answer. No, he wouldn't have listened. None of them would have. A janitor offering engineering advice would have been dismissed without a second thought. "I need to show these to someone," Robert said finally, gathering up the sketches. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back." Sarah watched him hurry out of the faculty lounge, her sketches clutched in his hand. She sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs, suddenly exhausted. Whether this led to something positive or simply got her fired for overstepping her bounds, at least she had tried. At least she had spoken up. 20 minutes later, Robert returned with Principal Johnson and Head of Maintenance David Walsh in tow. All 3 men looked like they had seen a ghost. "Sarah," Principal Johnson said, his voice carefully controlled, "Robert tells me you've proposed a solution to our playground problem." "I have." "And that you drew these engineering plans yourself." "Yes, sir." Principal Johnson spread the sketches out on the table, and Sarah watched as the 3 men studied her work. She could see the moment when they truly understood what they were looking at, the subtle shift in their expressions as they realized they were looking at professional-grade engineering work. "These calculations," David Walsh said slowly. He was the most technically minded of the 3, a former contractor who understood enough about construction to recognize quality work when he saw it. "These are completely accurate. And this solution." He paused, studying the drawings more closely. "This would actually work. This would solve the problem permanently. And for a fraction of what the contractors quoted us," Robert added. Principal Johnson looked up at Sarah, and for the first time since she'd started working at the school, she felt truly seen. "Sarah, I have to ask, why are you working as a janitor when you have this kind of expertise?" It was a fair question, and Sarah found herself answering with more honesty than she'd intended. "Because when my husband died, I had to choose between maintaining my professional credentials and keeping my daughter fed. Continuing education requirements, professional licensing fees, professional liability insurance, it all costs money I didn't have. And when you've been out of the field for more than a few years, it's nearly impossible to get back in. No one wants to hire an engineer with a gap in their employment history, especially not a woman with a young child." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. There was respect in it now and something that might have been shame. "What would it cost to implement your solution?" Principal Johnson asked finally. Sarah had already calculated this, of course. "Materials would run about $8,000. Labor, if we hire it out, would probably be another $6,000 or $7,000. The total project should be under $15,000. $15,000, David Walsh repeated wonderingly. The lowest bid we received from the engineering firms was $68,000, and that was for a solution that wouldn't have been as comprehensive as this. There's something else we need to discuss, Principal Johnson said, his expression becoming more serious. We can't ask you to work on this project for free, not with your level of expertise. But the school board would never approve hiring an outside engineer when we already have you on staff. Sarah felt her heart sink. She could see where this was going. They would use her solution but continue to pay her janitor wages for engineering work. It wouldn't be the first time she'd been taken advantage of. But Principal Johnson surprised her. What I'm proposing is that we temporarily promote you to a consulting position for this project. You would work directly with the contractors to oversee the implementation of your design, and you would be compensated appropriately for your expertise. What kind of compensation? Sarah asked carefully. The same rate we would pay an outside consulting engineer, $75 per hour for the duration of the project. Sarah's breath caught. At that rate, even a small project would earn her more than she made in a month as a janitor. And after the project is finished? We'll discuss that when the time comes, Principal Johnson said. But Sarah, I think it's safe to say that your role at this school is going to change significantly. The project began the following Monday. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of directing contractors who had far more construction experience than she did, but who deferred to her expertise when it came to the technical aspects of the work. It was strange, after 2 years of invisibility, to suddenly find herself at the center of attention. The other staff members' reactions varied widely. Some were genuinely impressed and supportive, excited to discover that their quiet janitor was actually a brilliant engineer. Others seemed almost resentful, as if Sarah had been deceiving them by not revealing her background earlier. A few appeared to be waiting for her to fail, convinced that this was all some kind of elaborate mistake. Emma was thrilled. She couldn't fully understand the technical aspects of what her mother was doing, but she understood that it was important and that people were finally recognizing how smart her mom was. She would come to the playground after school each day to watch the progress, her face glowing with pride as she saw her mother directing the work. The project proceeded smoothly, exactly according to Sarah's specifications. The contractors, initially skeptical about taking directions from someone they had assumed was just a janitor, quickly realized that Sarah knew exactly what she was talking about. Her calculations were precise, her modifications were ingenious, and her understanding of structural engineering was clearly sophisticated. But the real test came when the work was complete and the school's insurance inspector arrived to certify the playground for reopening. The inspector was a grizzled man named Frank Morales who had been evaluating playground safety for over 20 years. He was known for his thoroughness and his unwillingness to approve anything that didn't meet the highest safety standards. Sarah stood nervously beside Principal Johnson as Frank conducted his inspection. Every joint was tested, every measurement verified, every safety factor calculated. The inspection took over 3 hours, during which Frank said very little, making notes on his clipboard and occasionally asking technical questions that Sarah answered with growing confidence. Finally, Frank stepped back and looked at the completed structure. Then he turned to Principal Johnson with an expression of genuine surprise. "In 20 years of doing this job," Frank said, "I have never seen playground equipment that exceeds safety standards by this much. Whoever designed this modification didn't just fix the problem. They made the structure safer than it was when it was first installed. This is some of the finest structural engineering work I've ever seen applied to playground equipment." He turned to Sarah. "You did this?" "Yes, sir." Frank nodded slowly. "Well, I don't know what you were doing before this, but you should be doing more of it. This is exceptional work." The playground reopened the following day, and the children's joy was infectious. Sarah watched from her office window as Emma and her classmates raced up the slide stairs and flew down the newly secure slide, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt like herself again. But the story was far from over. Word of Sarah's expertise had begun to spread beyond the school. The insurance inspector had mentioned the project to his colleagues, And soon Sarah was receiving inquiries from other schools and organizations dealing with similar structural problems. Principal Johnson, to his credit, was supportive of Sarah taking on additional consulting work, as long as it didn't interfere with her responsibilities at the school. Within 6 months, Sarah had established a small but growing consulting practice specializing in educational facility repairs and modifications. Her reputation for providing high-quality engineering solutions at affordable prices spread throughout the district and then beyond. She was finally able to renew her professional engineering license and professional liability insurance, officially returning to the career she had never wanted to leave. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Sarah stood taller now, spoke with greater confidence, and began to see possibilities for the future that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. Emma noticed the change too, telling her mother that she seemed more like herself than she had in a long time. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how Sarah was perceived by her colleagues at the school. She was no longer invisible. Teachers sought out her opinion on facility issues, administrators included her in planning discussions, and even the students began to see her differently. She was still doing some janitorial work. The school couldn't afford to lose her completely in that role yet, but everyone understood that she was much more than just a janitor. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing plans for another playground project, Emma approached her with a serious expression on her 6-year-old face. "Mom," Emma said, "are you happy now?" Sarah looked up from her work, considering the question carefully. Was she happy? For the first time in years, the answer was yes. Not because her life was perfect. She still faced challenges as a single mother, still worried about money and Emma's future, still felt the grief of David's absence. But she was using her mind again, solving problems, making a difference. She was visible. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling Emma into her lap. "I think I am happy." "Good," Emma said with the simple satisfaction of a child whose world has been set right. "You deserve to be happy." As Sarah held her daughter and looked out at the playground where children were safely enjoying the slide she had fixed, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had taken courage to speak up, to risk being dismissed or ridiculed. It had taken faith in herself when no one else had faith in her. But most importantly, it had taken the recognition that being invisible was a choice, and that she could choose differently. The single mom janitor who had been told to just fix the slide had done exactly that. But in the process, she had fixed something much more important. She had fixed herself.